Welcome back to Series Flicks Central. Today, we're diving back into the world of Sullivan's Crossing, that breathtaking slice of Nova Scotia, where secrets and second chances go hand in hand. What if Season 4 took everything you thought you knew and turned it inside out? What if Maggie's past came knocking, just as she was finally finding her footing? A situation where old loves resurface, loyalties are tested, and no heart is left unbroken. So grab your coffee, get cozy, and let's head back to the crossing, because the story is far from over. The sun rose over the majestic landscape of Sullivan's Crossing, with a kind of apologetic brilliance, as if trying to make up for the storm that had descended upon the lives of its inhabitants the night before. It was one of those classic, piercingly beautiful Nova Scotia mornings where the light didn't just shine, it seemed to spill like liquid gold over the jagged tips of the pine trees, catching in the heavy mist that rolled off the lake. The water was a sheet of glass, disturbed only by the occasional ripple of a trout surfacing for a fly, or the gentle wake of a loon gliding through the reeds. If you were a stranger passing through, standing on the edge of the wooden dock with a steaming cup of coffee in hand, you would think this was the most peaceful place on earth. The air smelled of damp earth, pine needles, and the faint, salty promise of the ocean miles away. It was a perfect morning. But for the people inside the cabins, the brightness of the day felt like a stark, blinding contrast to the heavy confusion that had settled over them. Inside the main lodge, the silence wasn't peaceful, it was thick. It was the kind of silence that hangs in the air after a cymbal crash, vibrating with the memory of the noise long after the sound has faded. Maggie Sullivan lay awake in her bed, staring at the wooden beams of the ceiling, a map of knots and grain she had memorized since childhood. She had counted every imperfection in the wood, tracing the lines with her eyes as the hours ticked by on her bedside clock. Sleep had been a visitor that refused to stay, chasing her into the early hours of the morning, only to abandon her as soon as the first light touched the window pane. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the scene at Rob's diner replay in vivid, humiliating detail. The music stopping, the crowd parting, and Liam, standing there with that lopsided grin that used to charm her when she was 22 and reckless, but now only looked like a demolition charge, strapped to the foundation of the life she was trying to build. She turned her head slowly, the pillowcase cool against her cheek, looking out the window toward the guest cabin, where Cal was staying. The curtains were drawn tight. Was he awake too? Was he packing his bags? The thought made her chest tighten, a physical ache that felt dangerously like panic. She forced herself to breathe, employing the rhythmic techniques she taught her patients before surgery to lower their heart rates. In through the nose, holding for 3 counts, out through the mouth. It was a way to ground herself, to remind her body that she was safe, even if her mind felt like it was sprinting through a minefield. But it was hard to be the doctor when you were the one on the table. Across the campground, Cal Jones was indeed awake. He hadn't slept at all. He was sitting on the edge of his bed, still dressed in the flannel shirt he had worn the night before, a mug of cold coffee resting forgotten in his hands. He hadn't packed. He hadn't moved much at all since returning from the diner. He just sat there, listening to the birds start their morning chorus, feeling a profound sense of disorientation. Sullivan's Crossing had become his sanctuary, the place where the noise of his own past had finally quieted down, where the grief he carried had started to feel lighter. And now? Now there was a new noise, a loud British noise that claimed to be Maggie's husband. Cal wasn't angry, he was too tired for anger, and perhaps too hurt for it. He was just confused. And in that confusion, he found himself doing the only thing he knew how to do when the world stopped making sense. He waited. He waited for the sun to rise fully, waited for the campground to wake up, and waited for Maggie to make the first move. But there was one person in the crossing who had slept like a baby, entirely unburdened by the emotional wreckage of the previous evening. In the guest cabin usually reserved for weekend hikers, Liam Davies stretched his arms over his head, listening to the satisfying crack of his spine. He rolled out of bed, kicking off the heavy quilt, and walked to the window. He pulled back the curtains with a flourish, blinking happily at the blinding sunlight that flooded the small wooden room. To him, this wasn't a disaster zone or a place of reckoning. It was a holiday. A very interesting, potentially profitable holiday in the Canadian wilderness. Hingwei Justel Poisonous and Huaf. He looked around the cabin, admiring the rustic charm, the antlers on the wall, the smell of cedar. It was quaint, he decided. Very Canadiana. He grabbed his towel and headed for the communal showers, whistling a tune that was entirely too cheerful for the circumstances, greeting a confused squirrel on the porch with a wink.
Morning, mate. Lovely day for a reunion, isn't it?
The squirrel, wisely, scurried away up a pine tree, wanting no part of whatever chaos Liam was bringing to the breakfast table. An hour later, the smell of frying bacon and brewing coffee began to drift from the main lodge kitchen, cutting through the crisp morning air. It was the universal signal that the day had officially begun, regardless of whether anyone was ready for it. Sully stood at the stove, his movements mechanical and heavy. He cracked eggs into the cast-iron skillet with a little more force than necessary, the shells shattering under his large, calloused thumbs. Beside him, Frank was leaning against the counter, nursing a mug of tea, his usually jovial face drawn into a frown of concern. The two men, pillars of the crossing, existed in a comfortable silence usually, but today the air between them was charged with unspoken questions. So, he's still here?
Unless he sprouted wings and flew back to Boston in the middle of the night. Yeah, he's still here.
And you're sure about what you heard? I mean, with the music and the noise. Maybe he said cousin. Or husband's friend.
He said, husband Frank. Clear as a bell. And Maggie didn't deny it.
Sully flipped the bacon, the grease hissing angrily as it hit the hot metal. He wasn't a man who liked surprises. He liked schedules, he liked supply lists. He liked knowing which trails were washed out and which campers were overdue. He found comfort in the predictability of the seasons and the reliability of the land. He did not like strangers claiming to be legally wed to his daughter, especially not when his daughter had finally seemed happy. He had watched Maggie blossom over the last year, shedding the hard shell of her Boston life, and the thought of that progress being undone by this interloper made his grip on the spatula tighten. The screen door creaked open, the familiar sound usually signaling a cheerful start to the day, but today it felt tentative. Maggie walked in. She looked like she was moving through water-slow, deliberate movements, her eyes slightly puffy from the lack of sleep. She offered a weak, apologetic smile to Frank, who returned it with a sympathetic nod, his eyes full of questions he knew better than to ask right now. Morning.
Morning, Mags. Coffee's fresh.
It was a peace offering, a cup of coffee instead of an interrogation. Sully knew his daughter. He knew that pushing her before she had caffeine in her system would only make her retreat further into herself. Maggie accepted the mug gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic as if it could thaw the chill that had settled deep inside her bones. She took a sip, closing her eyes for a brief second, letting the warmth travel down her throat. Is Caltes coming for breakfast?
Haven't seen him.
The answer hung in the air, heavy and unresolved. It was the absence that spoke loudest. Calgal was always there for breakfast, usually discussing the trail maintenance or the weather forecast with Sully. His absence felt like a judgment. But before Maggie could ask anything else, or perhaps apologize for the disruption, the door swung open again. This time, the energy in the room shifted instantly. It wasn't the somber entry of a regretful party. It was an entrance. Liam breezed into the kitchen as if he had lived there for years, the screen door slamming shut behind him with a cheerful thwack. He was dressed in clothes that looked conspicuously out of place amidst the flannel and denim of the crossing designer jeans that had never seen dirt, and a crisp, patterned shirt that probably cost more than the stove Sully was cooking on. He looked fresh, rested, and irritatingly vibrant.
Something smells divine. Don't tell me maple smoked bacon? Local cure?
The room went silent. Frank stared at him over the rim of his tea mug. Sully stared at him with the flat, unimpressed gaze of a man who had stared down bears. Maggie just stared into her coffee cup, wishing she could dissolve into the dark liquid and disappear. Liam, oblivious or perhaps just expertly ignoring the Arctic temperature of the room, walked right up to the stove and peered into the skillet, inhaling deeply.
You must be Harry. Maggie's told me. Well, she hasn't told me much, actually. But everyone calls you Sully, right? I'm Liam. But you know that. I know.
Sully's voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder rolling over the hills. He didn't turn to look at Liam, he kept his eyes on the eggs, flipping them with practiced precision. He didn't offer his hand, Liam didn't seem fazed by the lack of welcome. He turned to Frank, flashing that charming boyish grin that had probably gotten him out of speeding tickets, overdue rent payments, and difficult breakups for the last decade.
And you must be Frank, the man who runs the outfitters. I need to stop by later, actually. My boots aren't exactly built for this terrain. Beautiful country, though. Reminds me a bit of the Highlands, but with fewer sheep.
Right, the Highlands. Frank, bless his heart, was too polite to be rude, even when he was confused. He shook Liam's hand tentatively, his eyes darting to Maggie for some kind of explanation, but she kept her head down. So you're visiting? From Boston?
Boston via London, well, everywhere, really. I'm a bit of a nomad. An artist, you know. The world is my studio. But yes, Boston was where Maggie and I met. The good old days. Residency was tough on her, you know. I like to think I was the comic relief.
Maggie finally looked up. Her eyes were hard, the neurosurgeon in her surfacing to take control of the situation. Liam, sit down, please. She didn't shout, but there was a steeliness in her voice that made Liam pause in his rambling. He held up his hands in mock surrender, a playful glint in his eye, and pulled out a chair at the long wooden table. The scrape of the chair legs against the floorboards seemed incredibly loud in the quiet kitchen. Just as he sat, the door opened one last time. Cale walked in. He looked tired, his hair was unkempt, lacking its usual order, and his flannel shirt was buttoned wrong at the cuff, a small detail that screamed of a distracted mind. He stopped dead in the doorway when he saw Liam sitting at the family table, a fork already in hand, looking for all the world like he belonged there. For a second, the air left the room. It looked like Cal might turn around and walk back out, retreating to the safety of his cabin, but then he looked at Maggie. He saw the exhaustion etched into her face, the way her shoulders were hunched defensively, protecting herself from the judgment of the room. And because Cal Jones was a good man, perhaps too good of a man, he didn't leave. He walked over to the coffee pot, poured himself a mug with deliberate slowness, and sat down at the opposite end of the table from Liam. The breakfast that followed was a masterclass in awkwardness. The only sound was the scraping of forks on plates, the clinking of mugs, and Liam's voice. He filled the silence that no one else dared to touch. He told stories about a gallery opening in Paris, where the ceiling leaked blue paint onto the guests, about a road trip through Italy in a car with no brakes, about a time he was chased by a goat in Greece. He was funny, that was the worst part. He was genuinely charismatic, weaving tales with a natural storyteller's gift that would have normally had Frank laughing and Sully chuckling. But today, his stories were met with polite nods and silence. It was as if he was performing a one-man show for an empty theater. Maggie didn't eat. She pushed her eggs around her plate, creating little yellow mountains and valleys, her mind racing. She watched Cal out of the corner of her eye. He was eating, but he wasn't looking at anyone. He was focused entirely on his plate, chewing methodically, as if the secret to the universe was hidden in his toast. He was building a wall, brick by brick, right there at the breakfast table.
So there I was, hanging off the side of this bridge in Venice, trying to get the perfect angle for the sketch, and the gondolier starts yelling at me in Italian. And I thought, well, this is it. This is how I go. Death by gondola.
Liam laughed at his own story, wiping a tear from his eye. He looked around the table, finally seeming to notice that he was the only one laughing. The smile faltered on his face just slightly, the first crack in his armor. He cleared his throat, taking a sip of orange juice.
Tough crowd. Is it always this serious in the morning, or is it just the country air? We've got a lot of work to do today. The crossing doesn't run itself.
Sully stood up abruptly, his chair legs screeching. His plate was empty. He carried it to the sink, the ceramic clattering loudly against the metal basin, a sound of finality.
Frank, I need you to check the inventory on the kayaks. We've got a group coming in on Thursday. Cal, if you're up for it, the North Trail needs clearing. Storm brought down a few branches.
I'm on it.
Cal stood up immediately, grateful for the excuse to leave, to be anywhere but at this table. He grabbed his hat from the peg by the door. He paused for a fraction of a second as he passed Maggie's chair. His hand twitched, as if he wanted to touch her shoulder, to offer some small comfort or perhaps to seek it. But he didn't. He kept his hands at his sides and walked out, the screen door shutting softly behind him. Maggie watched him go, a lump forming in her throat that made it hard to swallow. She felt a sudden surge of anger, not at Cal, but at the situation. At the absurdity of it all, at Liam for eating toast while her world crumbled. She stood up. I'll help with the dishes.
I'll help too. Least I can do for the hospitality.
No, you stay there. Her voice was sharp, sharper than she intended. Liam raised an eyebrow but stayed seated, happily buttering another piece of toast, unbothered by the rejection. Sully watched the exchange, his eyes narrowing, as Maggie carried a stack of plates to the sink. Sully moved in beside her. He turned on the faucet, the rush of water drowning out their voices from the table, creating a private bubble of noise.
Maggie, talk to me.
Dad, not now.
Yes, now. That man in there, he's acting like he's on a vacation. But he introduced himself as your husband. I need to know if I need to call the sheriff, or a lawyer, or a priest.
Maggie scrubbed a plate fiercely, the hot water turning her hands pink. She looked at her father, seeing the worry etched into the lines of his face. She knew she owed him an explanation. She owed everyone an explanation. But the truth was so stupid. It wasn't sinister. It wasn't a dark secret she had kept out of malice. It was a mistake. A paperwork error born of a young woman's desire to help a friend who was down on his luck. He's not dangerous, Dad. He's an old friend. From a long time ago, we helped each other out when we were young and broke. It's a misunderstanding, a legal technicality.
A legal technicality usually doesn't show up to a party and announce itself to the whole town.
I know it looks bad. But he's just Liam. He's dramatic, he's flighty. He probably doesn't even realize the chaos he's caused.
Dad.
I'll talk to him. I'll sort it out. I just need you to trust me. Please. Sully looked at her for a long moment. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the desperation to fix this herself. He sighed, the tension in his shoulders dropping just an inch. He dried his hands on a towel, shaking his head slightly.
I trust you, Mags. You know that. But Cal's a good man. Don't let this misunderstanding cost you something real.
The words hit Maggie like a physical blow. She nodded, unable to speak around the lump in her throat. Sully squeezed her shoulder gently, a silent show of support, and walked out the back door to join Frank, leaving Maggie alone in the kitchen, with the hum of the refrigerator and the man in the other room. She took a deep breath, drying her hands on her apron. She needed to de-escalate this. She needed to get Liam to sign whatever papers were necessary, and get him on the next bus to Halifax. She composed her face into a mask of professional calm, the same face she wore when delivering bad news to a patient's family, and walked back into the dining area. Liam was just finishing his coffee. He smiled when he saw her, a genuine, easy smile that made it hard to stay angry at him.
Excellent breakfast. Your dad's a bit of a gruff one, isn't he? But salt of the earth, I can tell.
Liam, we need to talk, now.
Ooh, serious face. Okay. Let's talk. But not here. It's a bit stuffy, isn't it? Let's go for a walk. Show me this crossing you're so fond of.
Maggie hesitated, then nodded. Maybe it was better to do this outside, away from the prying ears of the lodge. She grabbed her jacket and led the way out onto the porch. The morning air was crisp, a welcome relief from the stifling atmosphere of the kitchen. They walked down the steps and onto the gravel path that led toward the lake. The campground was waking up in the distance. She could see a few campers emerging from their tents, could hear the laughter of children. It felt like a different world from the one she was currently inhabiting. She didn't make it far down the path. She stopped near the old tire swing that hung from the great oak tree, turning to face him. Why are you here, Liam? And don't give me the reunion speech.
Straight to business. You haven't changed. You know, that's what I always liked about you. No nonsense.
I'm serious. You embarrassed me. You hurt Cal. And for what? We signed those papers 10 years ago. You were supposed to file them.
I know. And I meant to. Honestly. But then, well, I got that grant in Barcelona. And then the visa issues in Tokyo. And the papers were in a box. And the box was in storage. You know how I am with admin.
So you just forgot? You forgot you were married?
It didn't feel like a marriage, did it? It was a piece of paper so I could paint in peace without immigration breathing down my neck. It was a favor. A lovely, noble favor from my best friend.
He stepped closer, his voice dropping, losing some of its theatrical edge. For a moment, he sounded like the Liam she remembered, the struggling artist she had shared ramen noodles with in a cramped Boston apartment, the one she had laughed with until 3 a.m.
I didn't come here to blow up your life, Mags. I swear. I was in the area. I heard you were here. I thought it would be funny. A surprise.
Funny? Liam, you walked in on my boyfriend and announced we were married. That's not funny, that's cruel.
Boyfriend? The brooding lumberjack? Is it serious?
Yes, it is. Or, it was, until last night. Liam looked down at his boots, scuffing the gravel. He looked genuinely sheepish, like a kid caught with his hand in the cookie jar.
Right. Okay. I see. I've made a mess of it, haven't I?
Yes, you have.
Well, I can fix it. I'll tell him. I'll tell everyone. It was a joke. A clerical error. We can get the papers signed. I'll file them myself this time, hand delivered to the judge.
Maggie felt a wave of relief so strong it almost made her knees weak. It was a misunderstanding. Just like she thought, Liam was an idiot, but he wasn't malicious. He was just Liam. You mean it?
Cross my heart. I'll head into town. Find a notary or whatever we need. We can clear this up by lunchtime.
Thank you, Liam. Really. She smiled. The first real smile she had worn in 12 hours. The tightness in her chest began to loosen. She looked toward the woods where Cal was working. She could fix this. She could find him, explain that Liam was leaving, that it was all over. It was just a blip. A weird, funny story they would tell years from now. I'll go get my car keys. We can drive to the lawyer in Timberlake. She turned to head back to the lodge, her step lighter, the weight of the morning lifting. But Liam didn't move. He stood by the tire swing, his hands in his pockets, watching her.
Actually, Mags?
Yeah? She stopped, turning back to him, her hand already reaching for the door handle of the lodge.
There is one small thing. Before we go to the lawyer.
What? The tone of his voice had changed again. It wasn't the playful Liam, and it wasn't the sheepish Liam. It was something else, something calm and terrifyingly matter-of-fact. It was the voice of someone who held all the cards.
I'm not going to Timberlake. I'm heading back to Boston. Today.
Okay, that's fine. We can mail the papers. Or I can drive you to the airport.
No, you're not listening. We are heading back to Boston. You and me.
Maggie frowned, confusion clouding her features again. The birds seemed to stop singing. The wind died down. I don't understand. Why would I go to Boston? I live here.
Because, my dear Maggie, I've got myself into a bit of a situation back there. A financial situation. And it turns out, having a successful neurosurgeon as a wife is remarkably helpful for securing, let's call them loans.
Liam, stop it. You're not making sense.
I need you to come with me, just for a few weeks. To show face, to sign a few things, to be the dutiful wife.
I'm not going anywhere with you.
Oh, I think you will. Because if you don't, well, I might just remember a few other details about our arrangement that the medical board might find very interesting. Fraud is a nasty word, isn't it?
The blood drained from Maggie's face. The green card marriage. It hadn't just been a favor, it had been illegal, and she was a doctor now. A professional with a license to lose. Liam wasn't here for a reunion. He wasn't here for a laugh. He was drowning. and he had decided to use her as his life raft. She stared at him, seeing the stranger beneath the familiar face. You can't be serious.
Pack a bag, Mags. We leave in an hour.
And why would I ever do that? Liam took a step closer, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried on the wind.
Well, because you're my wife.
He patted her on the cheek, a gesture that was patronizing and possessive all at once, then turned and walked casually toward his cabin, whistling that same cheerful tune. Maggie stood frozen on the path. The sun was still shining, the lake was still beautiful. But the peace of Sullivan's Crossing had shattered completely. She looked toward the woods where Cal was working, unaware that the ground had just fallen out from under them. She was trapped, and, for the first time in a long time, Maggie Sullivan didn't know how to operate her way out of it. And that is the end of episode 1. Wow. We knew Liam was trouble, but blackmail? That is a whole new level. It looks like Maggie is caught between her past and her future, in the worst way possible. What do you think Maggie should do? Should she call his bluff and tell Cal the truth about the fraud, risking her medical license? Or should she go to Boston with Liam to protect her secret, even if it breaks Cal's heart? Let us know your theories in the comments section below. We read every single one. And if you enjoyed this return to Sullivan's Crossing, please leave a like, it really helps the channel. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell icon so you don't miss episode 2, where we find out if Maggie actually gets in that car. Thanks for watching Series Flick Central, and we'll see you at the crossing next time.